Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for attending and tuning in for today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to be an introduction into using Inventor for visualization of your 3D models, specifically using the Inventor Studio sub-environment of Inventor. So just real quickly, I would like to introduce myself. I've probably met most of you before. My name is Steve Olson. I am the manager of training services here at Mesa, which just means that I kind of set our schedule, pick the classes, assign instructors, but I do all the same other stuff that everybody else does in terms of teaching classes, support work, consulting, a little bit of everything on the tech side of things. I'm a certified instructor by Autodesk, which means I've gone through their training that says what a good class should look like. And I'm also certified in Inventor and AutoCAD and a couple other products that just really aren't really relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, but those are the same products that lots of you folks are using out there. I've been at Mesa for 10 years now, and before that, I spent 5 years at a company called Fleetwood Folding Trailers. If you've ever seen the little box trailers where the roof comes up and the bed slide out, that's what I did for 5 years using a variety of CAD applications. So I want to kind of get an idea of who's tuned in today. So I have a couple quick polls just to help me understand, who I've got in my audience here. So I'm going to send out a quick poll here. I'd like to know who out there is already using visualization. So let me kind of just launch this poll real quick and go ahead and cast your votes. Once we get a good number of you responding, we'll kind of close the poll and take a look at the results. All right, looks like most of you have responded. So let's take a look at your response there in terms of what you guys. So a lot of you are basically already doing visualizations. You're maybe just looking for a little bit of help here. You don't do them yet. You're just not sure what to use, and you just don't. And some of you just don't need them right now. And actually, nobody's responded with the outsourcing. So one more question here. Let me hide those results, and I'll share another one here. I want to know what you guys are using to create them. So what are you guys using to create them? Are you using Inventor Studio, using 3ds Max? Navisworks actually has that option. So go ahead. So a lot of you are using Inventor Studio. That's kind of what I kind of had figured. Okay, looks like most of you have already responded. So I'll close the poll and share the results. So you see that about 77% of you are already using Inventor Studio, and my sarcastic response of yes, that you aren't doing them. I kind of recognize that I was asking that question twice in some respects. All right, so let's kind of get back to my PowerPoint here, so I can kind of introduce this idea. So I do have one more slide of that poll question. So now here's the topics that we're going to take a look at today. I want to introduce just the visualization functions, what are available to you in Inventor Studio, talk a little bit about some very entry-level applying lighting scenes and some realistic images, and then how to actually render either a still image or an animation. And let's kind of get into that. So let's talk about Inventor Studio. So what is Inventor Studio? Inventor Studio is an environment or sub-environment in Inventor It allows users to render still images or animations. It's pretty straightforward. Users can create cameras and lighting to kind of get the right scene. I always kind of think to myself that my first step is always I got to set the scene, just like I'd be making a movie or taking a picture. I got to get the scene set up just the way I want. And again, that's partially through cameras and lighting, also setting up the materials, or more specifically the appearances for your model. And then we can also, components and constraints can be animated to show the assembly actually working. So if you need to go beyond just a still image, we do have the ability to kind of animate pretty much components. We can actually animate the camera and also animate some of the lighting. You can see that that's the ribbon from Inventor Studio right there. And the first three are really just rendering the images or animation, getting into the last view. That main scene panel there is just setting the lighting style, setting the camera, maybe adding a few additional lights. There's a little bit broader animate panel that has all the different types of animations we can do. But realistically, there's not too much that can be that's done in Studio. So let's take a look at just the process of rendering an image. So my general steps I always kind of try to follow and kind of share with folks is first you want to get your appearances set up. You want to make the model look like it is. Lots of times when I'm modeling, I don't always try to apply the end finishes or the end appearances. Maybe sometimes I'll add color just to kind of give me something more interesting to look at than all those grays. But you want to apply the right appearances. Maybe get something a little bit more flashy looking. You want to define your studio lighting style, and that can be anything that's just lights, or there's actually some that have what they call an image-based light, or an IBL, that has a scene that can be associated with that and displayed. We'll take a look at that. Define cameras. So again, we can just render just what our screen sees, our current view, or we can set up a camera and have that rendered. Defining a camera is going to be critical if you want to animate it, because we can't animate just the current view. We've got to animate a specific camera. Defining local lights. We can actually add additional lights if we don't have the right lighting scene set up, or the lights right in the scenes. We can add those. A very simple thing to do is just set a lighting style and leave it alone. But if you want to do something a little bit flashier, a little bit more intriguing, you can definitely add some more dynamic lighting. Then we're going to have to render the image, and then we can save the image once it's rendered. So, and we can get something that looks a little bit like that. So rendering the image has some specific settings here that I will take a look at. So realistically, in general, it's going to want to know the size, the width, and height of the image. And then we also can define what's being rendered. Is it a specific camera or just our current view? And then we can pick the lighting style. We could actually have one lighting style active in our scene right now, but actually render with a different one if that's what we need to do. Because we could actually set up multiple different renders all from one CAD model and then render those with different settings each time. Once we've got that set up, we can go to the Output tab. When you're doing just an image, the Output tab isn't really that critical, because once it's done rendering, we can actually, there's a button there to allow us to save the image right from there. I typically will do this anyway, even though it's not important. That way I make sure I get the output captured. And then the last tab here is renderer. The biggest thing here is the duration. How long are we going to allow the duration to run, or the render to kind of calculate in the background? So we actually have three settings there. I 90% of the time use either the render time or render by duration, and mostly that's because for me, I'm usually trying to do something quick in a class or whatever. So rendering by time or iteration, I usually have those set fairly low, just to kind of get things done quickly in a class, just like I'll do here in just a few minutes. But the biggest thing is you want to give it a lot of time to kind of calculate it, kind of go through these. What ends up happening here is that you'll set the render, it'll start off with a really grainy image, and it'll go through with passes to try to clean that up. I actually was looking in 3ds Max the other day, and actually 3ds Max refers to it as noise in the image and quantifies it with decibels, which I thought was really kind of interesting the way it defined it. But really the process here in both cases, no matter which product you're using, is really the same. And same thing would go to Navisworks if you were using that as well. It's going to start off with a number of iterations, and it'll go through one at a time, trying to pass through and kind of clean things up. If I tell it a time, it will just say, okay, I'm going to do as many passes as I can in the 1 or 2 minutes, whatever amount of time you give it. Render by iterations, it will say, okay, I have a maximum number of iterations I'm allowed to go to. Realistically, with the until satisfactory, what would happen is it would just start and keep going and going and going until I stopped it. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting is there was a few times that I just said, I'm just going to let it sit for an hour or whatever. And by the time I came back to it, the software actually had stopped rendering and said, okay, I've gotten to the point where I can't do any better than this, so I stopped. And I just thought that was kind of interesting that the software would do that. It would eventually get to a point where it was like, I can't make any more passes. I've done everything I can, and it'll stop. But realistically, the until satisfactory would ignore the time and the number of iterations and wait for me to interact with it until saying that I'm happy with the level I have there. And then this is kind of what the dialog box looks like while it's rendering. You can see there it's got a little progress bar at the top. I always like to look at the numbers at the bottom. The iterations you'll see there, that will tick by. And so whether I'm doing by iterations by time, I always take a look at, okay, if I said 32 iterations, how long did it actually take to do that? Or vice versa. If I say, oh, I gave you 5 minutes, how many iterations did you get through? Realistically here, what I have found, to get something that's okay looking, you probably need to go at least 30 to 50. But if you have the time, if you've got, like, say, a lunch hour or whatever, you can say, well, I'm going to give it an hour and see how well it does in an hour. And sometimes I'll actually do that with a model just to see how good of an image I can get out of Inventor if I gave it an hour. So let's take a look here at the process for that. I have just this very simple model. It's like the fork to a bike frame. And I just want to take a look at some of these steps here for you. So just bear with me here. I'm going to jump over to Inventor, and I'm going to open up that front fork assembly. So you can see here I have a model that really doesn't have anything all that fancy in terms of appearances assigned. What I'm going to do is I'm going to assign some appearances now. So I'm going to go up to the little color wheel that will open up my appearance library. And what I've actually started doing more recently is I've actually started using the Autodesk material library, because I think there's ones that, or at least I partially feel that the materials or appearances in there are slightly better for rendering purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the Autodesk Appearance Library. And here with the Autodesk Appearance Library, I can tell it, well, if there's a subcategory I'm looking for, and maybe I'd like to apply some metallic paint to the lower fork and the section there. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to metallic paint. And I'm going to make some selections here. I'm just going to hold down Control so I can get multiple files or multiple parts selected here. And that's the main thing I want to grab. So I can find here, you can see as I scroll through these, it's actually going to show me kind of like a temporary preview of what that would look like. I'm going to go with this green one here. Let's see, there was a glossy forest green. I'm going to apply that one. So I'm going to right click and say assign to selection. It will assign that, and it'll actually add it to my document appearances. Let's say with these components here, I like to apply some sort of chrome. So I'm going to select these components. I'll switch over to a metal, and there should be a chrome. Should be a chrome polished, and I'll assign that to my selection. Looks like I missed one here. So I'll assign that one. And I missed this one here too. Let's get that. Make sure that's all. All right, so now I've got that. Let me switch to this one here, and I'll apply like an iron to that one, and there should be an iron cast here, so I'll set that. I'll apply that one, and then maybe this beam here, that main post, I'll assign the chrome one to that as well. So I've got all these appearances set up, so I'm going to go ahead and close my appearance browser, and I can jump over to my Inventor Studio environment. I'm going to jump into there. So what I typically do first is I kind of like to set the scene, which is mostly picking the appearance and material library. I'm sorry, not the appearance library, but the studio lighting style is what I meant to say there. So I'm going to go to my studio lighting style. You can see here I've got one already in the file. It's just a very generic one that has some lights laid out in a grid. I'm going to switch over to this country road. It actually is kind of like a dome shape here. If you've ever seen these before, they kind of have like an image wrapped to a dome. So I'm going to set this country road one. It's probably the one I use the most for this bicycle here. You'll see that I've applied it. It's changed the lighting style. You can see if I zoom in here, it's starting to reflect that environment in the model, but it's not really showing that scene yet. So I'll have to display that scene image here. And it'll just take a second, it'll turn that on. And if I kind of zoom out, you'll see what I was talking about. It's basically like almost like a snow globe type effect. And let's say I decided that that looks good, but I don't think the scale looks right. It's not a big deal. I can scale the entire environment. If I scale it down a little bit, that will make my part look a little bit bigger. And we'll just go a little bit further. And that looks pretty decent. So I can kind of get myself positioned to where I want to see this. One other thing that I could possibly do that I didn't do is now I'm getting this in here. I'm like, oh, that green on the green, I'm not really happy with that. So I'm going to save the changes here. I'm going to go back to my appearance library. And I can change the color of this. So I'm going to go to edit this. Maybe I want to use more of an orange or something like that. I usually like to use orange on this one. So I'll tell it I want to change the color. And I'll change it to more of an orange. So even though that was initially an orange, I can edit the appearance enough that it is actually that orange color. And I probably should have left it forest green in the name, but that's okay. We'll leave it like that for now. So now that I have this, again, I can kind of position this where I want. Maybe I want to be zoomed in, a little bit further out, kind of up to you. Kind of even orbit around a little bit if I want to. I'll zoom in right about there. That looks pretty good. Maybe try to center it a little bit better. Because all I'm going to do is just going to render what's on my screen. So I'm going to go up here to render image. I'm just going to leave the width and the height the same. I'm going to say for the camera to use the current view. And I have that lighting style set up. So I'm actually just going to leave that there. I'm going to go to my output here. I'm going to tell it to save the rendered image. I will save it on my desktop here, or I have a desktop folder that I have for this class. We'll just let it be called or just be a JPEG, but you can see I can do a JPEG or a PNG, some other file formats here. I'm going to go ahead and hit save here. So it's just going to pick the image. It hasn't rendered it yet. So if I go to the renderer then, you can see I can pick by render time or by iteration. When I tested this earlier, the iterations was actually fairly quick, so I'll leave it at 32. And I'll go ahead and hit render here. And it'll pop up that dialog box. You'll see it will go ahead and render real quick. So let's give it a moment. While it's thinking about that, just real quickly, I'll remind you, if you have any questions, feel free to use the question or the chat panel. As I do subsequent renders, I'll be looking for questions in there to try to answer. So if you have anything comes to mind while we wait on this, feel free to mention that there. So you can see, just took a couple seconds here for mine to get started. Sometimes it does take a few seconds to get it rolling, but you can see it starts out really grainy and starts working and starts passing. You can see that I can watch the iterations click by. You can see it's only been working for about 15 seconds. It got through the first 5 iterations. And as we kind of go through there, I can even kind of pan or at least scroll the image so I can make sure I've got the image framed appropriately. There's nothing worse than waiting like a half hour for an image and then you look at it like, oh man, I didn't frame that right. So I always try to make sure that in the very early stages while it's kind of churning through, take a look at that, make sure that I've got the right image, or at least the image framed the way that I want it to be, because that can be kind of a pain. What I was saying earlier about not having to save the image or set up the name while I'm doing this, I could tell it to stop it and then save what I have. And this really isn't a stop, it's more of a pause. That if I get to a point where I'm like, oh, that looks pretty good, I can pause it and I can say save it. So if you set yours up to like maybe something like 200 and after about 150, you're like, man, that was actually pretty good right there. You can pause it, stop it, and save it. If you hadn't set that up, it's not a big deal. So see, this is almost done. It's on 23. Once it's done, we'll take a look at the image to see what we have. Just 2 more iterations, and then we'll take a look at what we've got. But you can see I'm getting some of the reflection. Since this is Chrome, it is reflecting some of the environment, so the software is smart enough to do some of those as well. So that's completed. I have a folder over here that I was using to should have saved it to. There it is. There's the JPEG. And there's my image. I can do whatever I want with that. I can send it on to marketing or whoever was needing this. Again, this is the type of thing that if I need something for a presentation, for an internal meeting, or something's needed for marketing, that you do have the capabilities of doing these. So let me close this out because I'm kind of done with this one. And we'll take a look at a couple animations real quick because there's a bunch of different ways we can create animations. And I want to show you at least a couple different ways so you have some opportunities to kind of see how these are done. So just 1 second here. I'm going to go back over to my PowerPoint. There we go. So animation. So the general steps for the animation. We kind of position the components that the way we need them to be. We then can define the appearance, scene, the lighting styles, which is exactly the way we'd want. Again, same process here. There really is no difference between the appearances, the scenes, and the lighting between a still image and an animation. Then we define our animation actions, and there's a definite variety here. We can do positional reps. We can go from position rep 1 to position rep 2. We can change the override or the offset of a constraint. And there's also a component animation, which is a little bit like the presentation environment where you kind of pull things apart. Personally, I like the constraint and the positional reps because that gives me the ability to kind of set those up ahead of time, or at least just change a value. In the case of the positional reps, I can kind of set the 2 positions up and then tell it, okay, these are the 2 things I want to animate between. In the case of the constraint, it's just a matter of going in there and saying, well, I know this is the distance it can travel, setting that up. I'm not a big fan of the component one, simply because I need to pull it apart. And for that to happen, I have to suppress the constraints. So you almost have to do 2 things. First, you have to set up something that will suppress the constraint and then run something else to move the component. So that always felt like a lot of extra work to me. However, in the first 2, you kind of have, or at least in the case of the constraint, you kind of have to have it constrained using the right constraint that you can control that offset for. In the case of the component, you really don't have to worry about that, but then you do have to suppress it. So there's definitely some differences there, some pros and cons of each type. We can also animate a camera. So if we've got one set up, we can do a turntable animation, or we can say, well, I want to start here and I want to move over to here, and it will allow it to interpolate a path between the 2. And once we get all those things set up, we can then tell it to render the animation. So I'm going to do two here. I'm going to do a constraint and a positional rep. Again, those are my two that I feel are the easiest to use and the most comfortable with. So let me kind of get out of this one here. I'm going to open up this Arbor Press. So just to kind of point out what I have here is underneath this RAM, I do have a studio constraint. And if I click on it, you'll see that this face and this face are 60 millimeters apart. That's what this constraint's telling me, 60 millimeters, and it's the bottom of the RAM to the top of that plate right there. So I'm now going to jump into my environments. I'm not going to set up the appearances or anything like that. We've already seen that. So I'm going to go to the studio. So now I'm in Inventor Studio. I'm going to go to my studio lighting styles. And I don't necessarily have to set up anything. I don't have to use the ones with the images. I just think that they always make something a little bit more intriguing. The empty lab works really good for small components because it basically makes it look like it's sitting on a countertop in a lab somewhere. So I'll display the imagery as well. Give that a second. So if I kind of zoom out here, you'll see that it looks like it's sitting on the table in some sort of lab. And what I think is kind of neat, you can see that as I orbit pan around, it is actually turning off walls and turning on other ones, like turn off the floor, the ceiling, depending upon what my vantage point is. So I'm going to kind of get to a decent vantage point here. And let's say this looks kind of like what I like to see or like to render something with the background like that. Now maybe my component's not turned right, so I could rotate again the background. I always like to do that anyway, just because if things look too centered or squared, they definitely look like it's too animated or too fake. So let me kind of find a good rotation angle here. That looks pretty good there. So now I haven't made a camera yet, so I want to show you how to set up a camera. So I'm going to save that setting there. So to create a camera, I have two ways. One is I can just create it from the view. So if I kind of get to an orientation that I'm pretty happy with, maybe zoom in just a little bit more, I can go to my cameras over here in my browser. I'm just going to right click and say create a camera from what I've got as my view right now. So you see I get this little box created there. If I zoom out and kind of orbit around, you'll see that my camera's way out here in space, and that block right there is its target. So what I'm going to do now is I can double check that. So if I right click on this camera one and I say edit, it'll turn on the edit of that camera, and I can make some edits if I want. If I want to change the position so it's not so far away, I can click on the position there, and you'll see I'll highlight that line. I can kind of position it more, say right there. That's not what I want to do. That's actually, I was thinking of something else there. So target, I can pick on. Position is actually a little bit different than what I was thinking of. That will allow me to move it in 3D space. I was thinking of the way that when I make a camera, if I want to make one, I basically pick a target, and then I can kind of drag my camera along that line to where I want it positioned. And I click to drop it. You can see there. One thing to always make sure with these cameras is this little line here is at the 12 o'clock position of the camera. So sometimes when I do the camera from view, the software kind of has that on one of the two sides. So it's not always working the way that I want. So just a good way to check that. Another thing you could do to kind of verify that you have what you want is if you right click on one of these cameras, I could say, well, set my view to that camera. If I do that, you can see it's going to position me right about here. And actually, I was going to use the other one, but this one is a pretty decent vantage point. So I might just leave this one for what we're going to do my rendering from. So what I'll do here rendering wise is I want to set up the animation first. So if I go to the constraint animation, It'll say, well, I got to turn on the timeline for that to happen. That's okay. I'll say okay. So with the constraint animation, it's going to say, well, what constraint are you going to work with here? And I'm going to go to the RAM, and I'm going to find that studio constraint. That's what we just called it, so we knew which one it was and kind of pick it out of a list there. So I picked on it. You can see here it says, well, it's starting at 60 because that's the current offset value. What offset value do I want to end at? And I'll say, well, I want to end at maybe say 0. And I can tell how long of an animation should that be? Is it 5 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever? Let's say I want to start at maybe 1 second. I actually have to tell it to specify. If I went to previous, it would say, well, the previous animation, which there wasn't one, which would start at 0. But maybe I want to wait 1 second to start the animation. And maybe I want to end this at, let's say I want to end it at, we'll say 9 seconds, and I have a 10-second animation overall. So I'm going to end it at 9. I'll say OK. And what will happen here is down at my timeline, you'll see that it'll jump, and I can kind of drag this playhead back and forth, and you'll see the animation there. You'll also see at the end of the timeline here, I can set which camera I want to have my viewport as. So I'm going to use camera 2. That's looking pretty good. If I expand out the timeline, you'll see that I'll have the animation there, and I could reposition this, or I can edit that animation after the fact. I could delete it, I could mirror it. I'm going to kind of just leave this as is. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of just minimize my timeline. I'm going to go ahead and do my animation now, or render my animation. So I'm going to go to render animation. I'll leave the width and height as is. I'm going to use camera 2 because that's the second camera I made. I decided that one was what I liked. For output here, I'll tell it to save this. I can save it as a WMV or an AVI. I'll say with a WMV. I'll let it go in here, and I'll call this, I'll just put a little bit of a different name because that one's already used in this folder. I'll call it webinar. I'll tell it to save it. Now, one thing when you're using an animation, one is right now I only have about 10 seconds of action, but if you look here, the time range, it's asking for how long. I'm actually going to set this to 10 seconds. So I'm going to go from 0 to 10 seconds. You remember our action is taking place from second 1 to second 9. So I have a 1 second buffer on either end. The other thing to notice here is the format. In the format, we have the ability to save it as a video, or we have the ability to save a sequential image format. So each frame would be an individual image. So the difference here is if I just do a video, I can say go ahead and go, and it would make an AVI or a WMV. If I go format, I say images, what would happen is it would save each frame as an individual image, but it wouldn't make the video out of it. I'd have to use some sort of third party or a program from another manufacturer that would be able to take each image and stitch it together as essentially a flip book, if you want to think of it in those terms, that each frame is a separate image, but stitched together as a video. I just recently did that just to kind of test it out, and I used a trial of Adobe After Effects to do that. And there's other products out there that can do that. I was talking to Dylan here, and he said well, there's about 3 or 4 different Adobe products that have that capability. And I also saw some other ones out there too. So it's not you have to use those. There's plenty of them out there that will do that. For simplicity's sake here, and so I don't have to go through that step, I'm just going to save it as a video. I will tell you that from folks that do this for a living, they prefer to save it as a sequence of image. And the reason being is if I'm 90% done and something crashes, if I was set to video, I'm done. I got to start all over from scratch, and I got to wait that 8 or 9 hours to get that rendering done. If I set sequence of image, I can see, okay, well, after frame 340, that's how many frames I have. Then I crashed, so I can then re-render from 341 to the end, and then I can use something to put them all together. So you just basically don't waste all that time if something happens in the meantime. But for our case, this is just a 10-second video. I'm only going to render it for about a minute or 2, so that's fine. Now, one thing here is also the frame rate. So notice it's at 15 seconds, which is fine. That's the default. The big thing I want to point out here is the number of frames per second, or the frame rate, paired with the render by iteration. So when I say I'm going to render by iteration, I have basically 15 frames and 10 seconds of video. That works out to 150 frames. And actually, the software will always add one as a buffer at the end. So I'd have 151 frames here that need rendered. If I use by iteration, it's going to render each frame 32 times, or 32 iterations through each frame. That's a lot of work. This is where you really can get a lot of time, hours rendering. So just be aware of that. Be conscious of that. To kind of short circuit that process, actually what maybe I can do is I can just tell it to render by 2 frames, or actually what I'll do, probably be easier here since I'm kind of going through a webinar here, is I'll tell it to render for maybe a minute and for maybe 2 minutes. And we'll go ahead and tell it to render, and it's going to ask about the bandwidth and the image size. I usually just leave these defaults here. I'll go ahead and say OK. So it's going to start rendering. As you can see, there's the 151 frames that I was talking about. And it's going to start rendering here. And like I said, I gave it 2 minutes. So while that's working here, we can take a look at some other things. I will show you some finished products, because this is going to turn out really grainy. You're going to say, boy, that looks like garbage, Steve. Why'd you even show me this video? I figured it was probably worth showing you a few that I allowed to render longer, because realistically, you're not going to be happy with a video that you rendered for like 2 minutes or even 5 minutes. You're going to want to give it a good half hour, hour. Even for a 10-second video, an hour is probably about as low as you want to let it render. But I have a couple here that I do have a couple here that I will show you while we wait for that to render. Here's roughly the same video done previously. It's not exactly the same one, but it's actually, that's the one I'm making right now. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. I'll go to this one here. Roughly the same model. And you can see I actually added a turntable operation there. I do see I have one question here. Do I prefer to use studio constraints or positional representations? I don't know if I have a preference between the two. I know that those are the two types I like to do. I think if I have to make the positional representations, then it makes a lot more sense. I also would say that with the positional representations, it might be easier if I have 2 or 3 things moving, that it might be easier to set up the start and end positions in positional representations as opposed to coordinating the constraints. That's probably the biggest thing that I would see as being kind of a pain, is making sure you have them constrained properly. And even in the positional representation, you are overriding constraint offset values. I guess you could suppress them as well, but so I don't know if I have a preference between the two, but I kind of go back and forth between them. I think it's probably just whatever I feel at the time. I have a tendency to be oh, what do I feel like doing this time? And I'll do one or the other based off of that. So here's a component animation that I have done previously. It's kind of basically an exploded view. And one of the things I had to do there was I had to essentially do a couple things. Once this thing was actually put together, so I had to do one constraint animation that suppressed the constraint. That was, you can do these things instantaneously, so they don't happen over time. But then I also had to create and basically move it out into space, and that was again an instantaneous move. And then I had to animate putting it back together. So this was really 3 separate. Each component had 3 separate animations on it technically. One to suppress a constraint and move it out in space, and then another one or a third one to then to move it back into position. So let's see here, one more. Here's another question. Do you ever have problems running 2 positional representations simultaneously? I don't know if I've ever done more than one. I'm just knowing that I could potentially do that. In almost every animation I do for a class or whatever, it's typically I go from one to another, and it's really only showing one component's the one that's driving. Everything else is kind of flexible with it. like in the case of this one, this is one that was done from a positional representation. I had one that closed, I had one that was open. I told it to go from one to the other, and then I mirrored between the two. So there are multiple different things moving. Realistically, it was one positional constraint, and actually it was if you can see here, there's a piston inside of that cylinder that's causing that to happen. So let me close this. I probably have killed enough time that my animation is, oh, nope, only about halfway done. So we'll give that just a little bit more time. Let me go to one more here. So this is a vise, and you can see there I do have some motion. Now you'll see that the handle is spinning as the jaw moves out. It's actually not done through any kind of positional or representation or whatever. This is actually a constraint animation that accomplishes this, but there is a motion constraint that controls that as that screw or as that jaw opens, that there is a spin set to the screw that will allow to do that. So that's just actually a motion constraint if you've seen any of those. And then you can see there's also a animation of that the camera is doing a turntable. Those are pretty easy to do. It's just a matter of picking an axis and telling it how many degrees it should rotate through. So let's see here. I was trying to hope for that one to render, but maybe we'll just go ahead and stop this one. It's not far enough along, but you've seen some of the outputs of it. I think that's the bigger deal here. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to get into doing a positional one so you can see how easy those are, and then we'll try to wrap it up here. So I'm going to go ahead and just close this one. I'm going to open up this excavator. Again, that was one of the ones I showed you as a sample here a minute ago. So realistically, underneath here, I do have three positional representations. I have a master, which technically is, I'd call it its closed position. I have open. And again, all I'm doing is controlling this piston, how far it is from the end of the housing there. And then there's one that's like halfway between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my studio environment. Kind of orient this into something a little bit more interesting here. We'll go from right about here. So if I do the positional representation, I'll have to turn on my timeline, like I said. And I'll tell it I want to start with the master. And I want to end with maybe, actually no, I want to start with I want to start with master and I want to end with open. And I want to tell it I want to go over maybe just 5 seconds so it's not as long of an animation. See here, so it's going to start. Let's see what I do. What did I do wrong there? Master to open, 5 seconds. Switch those around. Let's see if that works any better for me. Of course, it's not working for me now. What's going on here? I'll delete that one and start over again. Let's delete that. So I want to go from, so master is essentially closed and open is there. So let's try that one more time. All right, so I've got it positioned the way that I want. I'll go back into my pause reps. So I go from open, which it is now, to master. I'll tell it I want to go over just 5 seconds. Say OK. There we go. That's a lot better. Must have confused it. What is supposed to happen is supposed to be able to use Excel in the background. I'm wondering if there's a file in the background that was used previously when I was practicing. Now, let me save this as another file real quick. And we'll try that. Okay, so there we go. And take a look at our timeline. So that is there. And of course, what the software does in the background is it takes and uses Excel somehow to calculate how to go from one to the other. And I don't know why this is not working for me. Actually, I'm still in the original one. Let's try opening my copy. There's my copy. All right, so let's take a look at my animation timeline. Do I have that animation there? Let's try this real quick. Let's go back to, yep, that's master. That should be fine. I'm not sure what's going on here, guys. I apologize for that. I ran through all this morning to make sure it worked okay. And of course, now that I'm in front of everybody, you can see here it's actually telling me required to animate the positional representations. I wonder if it was having trouble launching Excel in the background is what my theory is. Like I said, I had done the other one earlier today, or practiced it earlier today, make sure it would work. I wonder if there was a file kind of hanging around in Excel that's preventing that from happening. And of course, this one isn't working. But that's how you set it up. And again, it does use Excel to do that in the background. And what I was trying to get was something that looks like this, where I set up that animation and I basically have it go from one to the other. And I didn't show you this, but I did show you earlier. If I right click on an animation, I can tell it to mirror it over. And I might, after I run this here real quick, I might try, let's try real quick. I'll delete this one and recreate that animation and see if that helps at all. Maybe I'll even delete this animation altogether. Yep, that's fine. I'll recreate another one. That might help me. So basically I have an animations branch here and I had one set up that I deleted. So I'm going to go from master, which is my close, to open. Tell it to go over 5 seconds. There must be something going on with Excel in the background here because it is just not working for me right now. I apologize for that, folks. Let's take a look here. I got a couple of you offering some suggestions. Maybe I will try killing my Excel here to see if that helps. That should get it to relaunch here. I'll delete this, recreate it. And it looks like I'm just going to be out of luck. I apologize about that one, folks. Let's wrap up. I've taken up enough of your time today, so let me just wrap up here. So a couple of you offered some suggestions and some questions there. So that's I think I've got all of them answered. If there was anything there that I didn't, I'll try to get back to you offline here, but it looks like I've got all of those kind of managed. I just have one kind of quick poll question for you. So are you guys ready to start doing this after kind of doing this after seeing the webinar? I think a lot of you said that you're already using Inventor Studio. And that's great. I just didn't know if anybody was doing something else. I know there's, I've had several questions from folks that that they were using Showcase, and that's kind of gone away. And a lot of folks really liked it because it was, you got some really nice looking images without having to spend a lot of time. You got, to me, you always got a little bit better image than what Inventor would give you. I realistically, if you haven't heard, what I feel, my personal take on it is that they purchased a product called Vred, which is VRED, and they were so similar. They were very, very similar, and I think they just felt like it wasn't worth keeping both. And the other one was more developed and it was heavily used in the auto industry, and that's kind of why it was out. And that's why it was kind of, I think, why they went with that one as opposed to the other one. But they 3ds Max, I think, for people that want to do some really high end, a little bit better what Inventor has, that's probably a good ending point. However, I will admit that it is a very difficult product to learn, or at least a little bit more difficult to learn. I always say that the learning curve on it is comparable to Inventor. I personally am trying to focus on what do I need to learn out of it to duplicate what I'm doing in an Inventor right now. And once I learn those skills, I'm going to then start pushing to some of the higher end stuff, because it can do a ton of different things. So I'm going to close that poll real quick, and I'll just share the results here. You can see that it kind of a little bit spread all over the place. Some of you are already doing this. Some of you think, hey, I think I'm ready, but I might need a little bit of help. Some of you would say, oh, I'm already doing all this. And then there's some of you that say this isn't part of what you need to do, and that's fine. Any of you out there that want maybe to go through some training, we do offer a one-day course that we go through all the different animation types, and so that is an option to you. We offer that fairly regularly. So if you're interested in that, talk to your sales guy or email me, and we can put a class together, get something on the schedule, and let you guys know when that's going to happen. So let me kind of get back to my last slide here, which is just a thank you for coming out or at least tuning in and listening today. I appreciate it. I did record this, so we'll probably have that posted to our website here probably in a day or two. So if you missed something or want to go back and watch it, or if you have a coworker that was unable to tune in, feel free to pass this along to them as well. Everybody, I thank you so much for tuning in. And again, if you guys need any follow-up or need any help in the future, that's what we're here for. Thank you guys very much. Have a good day.